I'm wondering who in this room has ever made a comment to themselves as they were coding within the code itself? Can we do one of these? I'm so happy to be in this room. It is usually not like that. So there could be a lot of reasons to do that. You probably each have your own, but for me, there may have been a variable that I was scared to change. I may have copy-pasted some code from Stack Overflow. That could have happened, and I realized that maybe I don't know exactly what it's doing, and I want to say something to myself. Or I may have made a choice that I wasn't quite sure about and wanted to explain what I was thinking to my future self. So when you all made that last comment, were any of you thinking of that comment as documentation? 3 people thought of it as documentation. Well, you've come to the right room, so we're going to be talking more about that. So documentation is what allows our code to be used, expanded, and adapted, and for a community to be formed around our code. So when you last wrote that comment into your code, why did you do it? You're probably making a note about something that was unclear. And we often don't think of comments as a form of documentation, but as this comic perfectly illustrates, these comments and these documentations can cause or relieve programmer pain. And we know which one of those we want to do, right? So comments as docs have different benefits than the long-form READMEs that we think of as documentation. They summarize the purpose of a particular file. That could be useful for folks who are taking a deep dive into new code bases. They can describe functions in place. They can give the why of a decision, and all in all, they're lowering cognitive load. So with all of these reasons to use in-code comments, you might think we'd be using them everywhere. But what's the problem with that? Yeah, we have comment rot, goes stale. So if we think of comments as code smell, it is a real problem. So when we're testing, if we use it, our test could point us to possibly outdated functions or even function strings, but there's nothing that I found, at least, let me know if I'm wrong, that will keep those inline comments up to date. So these too many comments do point to unclear code. And that's code that a dev would want to comment as they wrote it or as they reviewed it. So maybe it is time to refactor. But there's something that we forget when we talk about what should trigger a period of refactoring. If your workplace values creating code over maintaining code, you won't be given the time and support for that maintenance. And unfortunately, many of the companies, often small companies, that are most likely to emphasize code creation over maintenance are a junior developer's first job. So if I had $1 for every time a dev told me that their team didn't have time for code review and that it wasn't part of their culture, I could have paid a good portion of my rent last month just chatting with developers and talking to them about their comment troubles. So if you're not in that position, that's wonderful. But if you don't, or you find refactoring difficult in your personal projects, you probably have to work yourself up to a day of refactoring. You might put yourself into a good mood, go into your favorite room in the house, play concentration music softly, maybe draw a bath with some relaxing candles before you get down to work. So whatever that looks like for you, that perfect refactoring position, we don't want to put ourselves, in the spot where everything needs to be perfect to make our code readable and usable. And if we look at this comment again, it takes on a little more nuance when we start thinking about those rotten comments that we always have to worry about. So no longer is the message just commenting is important to support your community, but it takes on, additionally, having outdated comments is misleading, terrible, and might get you strung up by your tie. And in fact, there have been real losses that could have been avoided by a well-placed inline comment. In my research, I learned about incredible data loss due to a dove changing a value to null. And in such high-stakes situations where a mistake like that could be made, maybe it makes sense to have a nice little, like, boop, please be careful, you are standing over lava, or whatever seems like the right thing to say at that moment. So it's super hard to find the right commenting style because of all these competing interests. Even the grown-ups, the more experienced devs in our lives, have trouble doing this consistently, and best practices become sort of a do as I say, not as I do. So I'm going to show you some code from a time I was struggling to learn what comments were helpful. Now, this is dirty, nasty, filthy code, and we're going to have a little laugh at my expense by doing a game of critique those comments. So, in our first example, I used a tutorial as the base for this project, and I wanted to cite the tutorial and say, not all of this code is mine. We had starter code at the beginning, so I didn't have recruiters calling me and saying, congratulations, you're a developer now, I saw you on GitHub, and then having to be like, I'm sorry, I am still doing, Code Academy tutorials. Anybody else have that as their route to programming? Am I all alone here up in the front? Okay, well, I am just gonna stand up here. Now, later, I worked at a building at MIT, which was quite close to their climbing wall, and I want to make the most of that climbing wall, but this climbing wall was I want to say manned, but that is not inclusive language, so just pretend that the right word came to mind. So that wall was taken care of by students who would literally kind of show up and be like, okay, it's 2 p.m. now, I'll be here till 4, and they would update the website, and you had those 2 hours to come. So if you were like me and you were 2 buildings away and you were working on your machines, you might not see that notice at all. So I had a plan. I was going to do some web scraping. So I tried to teach myself how to do web scraping. This was my first time using Beautiful Soup, and I didn't know what I was doing at all. So I ended up with broken code, which I might need because it might be less broken than what I wrote next. So I commented that out just in case. I had some notes to myself about what I thought the code that I would write next should be doing, so I commented that out just in case. And I have notes about my understanding of what was wrong with the code that I had just written, so I commented that out just in case that was useful. And in this mess, there is my personal favorite comment of all time. Oh, it's a list. Thank God. So if you were to just walk into a code base and see anything that looked like this, you would shut the door and leave as quickly as you could, correct? That's terrible. I can barely read it, and I wrote it. So you wouldn't want to contribute to this code base. You wouldn't want to look at this code base. I don't want to look at this code base. I never did get my nifty scraper working, and it may have been because I couldn't read what I had just written. We don't want to put ourselves in this predicament. So before we think more about this problem, what makes a programmer? A programmer needs to know their language, their methods, They need to be able to apply problem solving and creative thinking. They need to be able to communicate and write usable code, not like what I did in the last slide. And possibly the air guitar helps. We're not sure about that one. And we spend a lot of time on that first point, knowing the language. But I want to talk about the journey through the other two, the thinking and communicating, since they're an important part of getting the mastery that we all desire. So there are some best practices as far as code commenting that we can get behind. We can agree that doc strings should have inputs, outputs, and document the transformation that occurs within. We can all agree that outdated comments, that code rot, those are dirty, filthy lies, and they have no place here. And sometimes we say that the code should tell us how, while the comments tell us why. Sometimes we say that we shouldn't waste everyone's time, and that a line-by-line commenting shows a lack of understanding. And clearly there's variation and room for different styles. You'll see that companies have different style guides, including what should be included in a doc string or a comment. And we can agree that comments, if used properly, because we all raised our hands at the beginning today, can be an invaluable part of a code base. So where's all this confusion about comments coming up? A lot of people feel like this, that there's no comment is bad code. And other folks say that, look, if you need to label your cats, you might not know what you're doing. And look at that poor cat. It actually doesn't seem to bother him that much. And then other folks say, look, maybe this is all part of a hazing process of becoming a real programmer that we just have to go through. This, confusion about commenting. So we get to debate. People banter back and forth on the internet. Our comments. And if you dare post a sincere question about commenting online, you're going to hear one response, louder than all of the others. So how many of you have seen the great Stack Overflow dry smackdown? A few folks. Maybe the others have never entered Stack Overflow's corner of the internet. So I learned how to code by using tutorials and by Googling a lot. So I spent a lot of time painfully swimming through Stack Overflow and asking lots of questions and hearing the same things over and over again. That code comments were wrong, all the way wrong, just wrong, no reason. You aren't a good programmer if you're using them, gross. And at the time, I dismissed it as, okay, there are a few jerks on the internet. I've heard about that. I promised myself that I would cultivate my in-person and online support network so I wouldn't have to feel the insecurity of the questions authors must be feeling. It was, after all, a space for one-upsmanship. I knew that. So the advice was, you should refactor. You should code better. Is that helpful at all? Just don't use comments. It'll be better. Only use the right comments. Oh, okay. And only your code matters. It's almost as if someone was yelling stop while throwing up their arms without telling you what to do instead. And I started to see this in several online spaces. Some were competitive, some were learning-oriented, but all of these were beginner-focused. And once I started seeing this attitude, I noticed it everywhere. Why were we doing this? Even in in-person pairing, I would notice that it was often an intermediate beginner. Someone who had been learning to program months or a year more than the person that they were pairing with, who are dishing out these dry ultimatums. So what was this toxic beginner who knows just a little bit more effect? So on one side of the spectrum, there's like the well-meaning, and then, but let's take a minute and go back to our internet jerk. And if you get this advice, there's many ways to interpret it. The thing that I heard loud and clear, and I actually saw it in type once, is the way you learn is an anti-pattern, because somebody's saying, well, oh, this will help me learn. So we have this person who's asked this like fairly earnest question. They want to know, I'm in this situation, how much should I be commenting? Please give advice. I'm just getting started and I want to be the best programmer I can. Please help. And what do you think the response was? This has been discussed to death. And I don't know any other way to interpret those words than so reading that, it's easy to forget that to that programmer that was earnestly asking that questions, those comments may be magic. You don't learn about commenting right away when you start learning to program. And when you do, you're like, wait, so I can make a note to the interpreter and, it's there for me and the interpreter just ignores it? That's super. And as you're starting programming, you're probably feeling like this. I did a lot of things today. I just don't know what they are. Help. And one thing, as I was writing this talk, I realized I wanted to show you some examples of my earliest comments, but none of them exist because I got the advice that if I was going to be considered a real programmer, I had better only post online the clean version of my code. So all those comments were painfully, and I do mean painfully, it actually hurt, scrubbed before I did that whole push commit sequence. So, having that experience, the next time I heard that someone's commenting style was an anti-pattern online, I just couldn't let it go. So I started asking questions. I said, hey, internet, do we all feel this way? And a whole 9 people responded. And I was like, wow, I'm really popular on Twitter and I'm so glad I have all this engagement. Look at the data, I have 9 responses. So I was a little bummed, but I said, this seems like a really important topic, so I'm just gonna ask again. So I put together a survey and asked a lot of questions. And I'm going to be sharing some of those results with you. So I asked, what describes your current and best use, current and recent use of comments? And surprisingly, just like the folks in this room, but unlike anyone who is willing to admit, no one is on the internet is willing to admit that they fall into this camp. But people who answer my survey and people in this room post inline comments. Is that surprising to anyone? Okay. Some people do it and some people don't. My favorite response was the person who said, as a child, I wrote comments. And I truly don't know if they mean their like programming child self or truly when they were 8 years old and learned to program. It could be either. And so at what point do people add comments? And a whole lot of folks add them towards the beginning, similarly to what I was doing. As they're experimenting and they're doing their scoping, comments come in there instead of towards the end, as I expected from my experiences hanging out on the internet. And a lot of people in their responses, showed that there had been a transition and a change within and how they thought about commenting. And I asked a series of questions that asked essentially in various ways, are comments helpful to you? So I asked, comments help me remember what my code does, and I apologize for the lack of labeling. 10 is a strong agree. So a strong agree on that with a very low tail. Comments help me clarify my thinking. There's a little bit more of a bump there. Comments can save current and future developers time. We're pretty sure that this is true. And then I asked the real moneymaker. Well, this isn't the real moneymaker yet. I'm sorry, it was too small and I couldn't read. But so comments help me learn was interesting to me because that was where things really started to spread out. So are people, not using them as a learning tool like I was? It kind of looks that way. There's a lot more spread there. And then I asked, comments are helpful to the individual contributor building a project, but like Veronica was told, they should be scrubbed before hitting your version control. And apparently I am the only one to have this experience, and I cheered a little inside because no one should have to go through that. We agree about function level comments. Everything else is a little unclear. And then I asked the real moneymaker. Clear code is self-documenting, just like on the internet. So clear code is self-documenting and doesn't need comments. And interestingly, look at that spread compared to most of the other questions, where we're really strong agrees or disagrees. So we really like the idea of comments, but most of us are still kind of holding on to this idea that maybe we should just be not showing anyone how unself-documenting our brains are. So if we're going to use comments, what's the best use of them? There's many ways to do documentation. I want to highlight a few. You could create a whole man page, say, I'm skipping the inline thing. I'm making whole man pages to describe sections of my code. We remember our dear friend, the cat. And you can also, this is one of my favorites. Apparently there's a whole Tumblr full of ASCII diagrams that describe people's code. I couldn't do it in words, so you are here. It's gonna go like this next. And I thought that was fabulous. And you should, the moral of the story here is you should definitely be doing whatever code you're writing. If this makes sense, please do that. I found this quote, and one thing that struck me is if we look at what we see committed to our repos and in our code, we learn not only about the problems we're solving, the tool we're making, but how we think about those problems. So essentially, our comments are telling us what our code does, but additionally, they're teaching us about how we think about problems and about ourselves. So what can we do for our beginner programmer? So we want to support learners where they're at, kind of praise their accomplishments, point them towards what their future them may want. They might not want all of those comments. And if you can remember the overwhelmed learner, it's a lot easier to do this. A lot of people suggested reading clean code, which would directly oppose most of the things I said here, but is a fairly standard manual that has really shaped the way a lot of people think about documentation and coding. And I think an important thing for us to think about is how we're thinking about comments. If we think about comments as something that will rot and cause us trouble later, we're not going to want to do them. We're going to tell other people that they shouldn't do them. But if we think about them as a form of early documentation, something that helps us decide what needs to go into a README and what doesn't, that's when we're going to be able to approach them in the most useful way, and even perhaps in the future build tooling around keeping them current. So this is me. I definitely encourage you, if you want to post the survey, I am happy to hear more about this topic. My one ask, since I've shared some of the results with you, is to not respond yourself, because you all know what that does to a data set. Don't do that to me. I'll cry. It'll be bad. So how are we on time and questions?
We have 5 minutes for questions.
Hooray, 5 minutes for questions.
Well, let's give her
Yeah.
Have you found a difference in people's opinion on the necessary inline comments, depending on which language they use? I found that depending on the expressiveness of the language, it really determines how self-documenting it is, which then determines how many inline comments I use. For example, I use a lot more inline comments when I'm programming in MATLAB than in Python, when I use even fewer comments when programming in something like Scala.
Sure. That is an excellent question. So he asked, did you find differences between languages that, that folks used? And because a lot of languages are more expressive, easier to read, therefore closer to self-documenting than others. And the unfortunate thing when I was designing this survey is I did not think of that as a factor. And if I could go back, roll back, that would be the #1 thing that I would add. Like, that is, if I've got a regret, that's it. A lot of people did talk about that in their short responses, and I've been thinking about ways that I can pull that out while not having problems in that some people mentioned and some people not. So I can like just group those together and say, of these, 30 people, it gives us some idea. And one thing that I've considered doing is making this a first run, and then spending more time on the design of the survey itself. So that is an excellent question, and I'm hoping there's more information coming down the pipes about that. But that's definitely a factor. Anybody else? Yeah.
Do you feel that docstrings are more along the lines of code or comments? Because in a lot of cases, docstrings are used to generate like short documentation that is used by people who are writing code.
The question is, do I consider docstrings more like code or comments? That's a little like asking a question about art in my mind. But I see them more I think it depends on whatever environment you're writing in, what they consider code versus commenting. I like to think of docstrings as code so that I make sure they happen, but there are lots of projects and communities where that's not the case or less important, and so, I think mileage varies. That's a good question, though.
time for one more question.
Yeah.
I was wondering if any of the respondents mentioned, like there's a lot of times where I'll make an actual comment to my comment, or I'll comment out a bit of old code that I'm not sure is supposed to be there, but I just thought that safe spaces. Did anybody in the stories talk about that, or I don't know if that was useful, or?
Sure. A lot of folks talked about having done that in the past as part of their learning process, and then moving away from that because they found that unless they had an explicit, this is what this is and what's wrong with it, even the learning part is lost over time. But many people did mention that. So it sounds like that's all we've got time for, but I'll be around. And I'm on Twitter, and I like when people ask me questions, so you should feel free to say hi.